The following instructions are based on the assumption that the correct joint tightness and guide pin setting has been established and that you are thoroughly familiar with the jig's use when routing single joints. These quadruple joints were made with the included 5/16 by 1.5 inch guide and a 5/16 inch bit. Tenon workpieces can be up to a maximum of 3 by 5.5 inches, with tenon sizes up to 1/2 by 2 inches, and a center spacing of 1.5 by 2.5 inches. Mark the location of your 4 tenon centers. Be sure to allow space between the tenons, at least slightly greater than the tenon bit diameter. It's only necessary to mark the location of the left mortises. It can be helpful to mark the location of the tenon board on the mortise board. Mark the faces that go against the clamp plate. Then flip the tenon board over and mark the bit depth on the opposite side. Pull the sight forward to its stop, and with the marked side against the clamp plate, place the tenon board against the side stop fence, bring it up to lightly touch the underside of the sight, and clamp it in place. Release the table and sight the left front tenon. Lock the table and move the left-right limit stop against the stop post and tighten it with the hex screwdriver. Then move the front-back limit stop against the stop post and tighten it. Unlock the table and sight the rear left tenon. Lock the table and move the front-back limit stop against the stop post and tighten it. Unlock the table and sight the rear right tenon. And finally, lock the table and move the left-right limit stop against the stop post and tighten it. All 4 limit stops are now precisely set. Lock the table and retract the sight. The table is now set up to route both the mortises and the tenons. We recommend beginners use a small, 1/4 inch thick, L-shaped shop-made guard in the guide recess to prevent routing into adjoining tenons. Placing numbers on the guard can be useful. Release the table and move it back, as it's always best to route the rear tenons first to enable the vacuum port to work more efficiently. Place the router on the jig. Lower the bit and start by climb routing clockwise without touching the guide pin to the guide to create a clean shoulder. Then route counterclockwise with the guide pin against the guide to complete the tenon. Turn off the power, raise the plunge, and remove the router from the table. Release the table, move it to the right, then lock the table and move the guard to position 2. Place the router back on the jig and route the rear right tenon. Again, start by climb routing clockwise, and finish up the tenon by routing counterclockwise. Remove the router. Release the table, pull it toward you, lock it, move the guard to position 3, and route the front right-hand tenon. And lastly, remove the router, release the table, move it to the left, lock it, and move the guard to position 4. Place the router on the jig and route the front left tenon. Turn off the power, raise the plunge, and remove the router from the table. All 4 tenons are now complete. Remove the tenon workpiece from the jig. Remove the guard and save it, as it is not required when routing the mortises. Release the table, move it to the back left position, lock the table, and extend the sight. With the clamps repositioned and the mark side toward the clamp plate, position the mortise board with the left mortise line centered under the sight. Clamp it in place. Retract the sight. Place the router on the table with the left guide pin in the mortise slot of the guide. Raise the plunge stop slightly to allow the mortise to be deeper than the tenon. Plunge the router and route the rear left mortise, starting with a series of overlapping plunge cuts at full depth. Then lock the plunge at full depth and clean out the mortise. Raise the plunge, but leave the router in place. Release the table and move it to the back right position. Lock the table and route the rear right mortise. Raise the plunge, release the table and pull it toward you. Lock the table and route the front right mortise. Raise the plunge, release the table, and move it to the left. Lock the table and route the front left mortise. Finish up routing the mortise and remove the router from the jig. All 4 mortises are now complete. Remove the mortise board from the jig. Then insert the tenon board in the mortise board. The result is a perfectly matching quadruple mortise and tenon joint.